Well, last night, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced changes to his cabinet. And Action SA's Herman Mashaba tweeted that the reshuffle is nothing more than rearranging the deck of chairs in a sinking ship. Khaya Sithole is an independent analyst, and he reckons that this was an underwhelming effort at placating factions and allies while managing a crisis. He joins us now via Zoom. A very good morning to you, Khaya. Strong views as usual. Are you saying this was more a political chess game than an effort to tackle the challenges the country faces?
Good morning to the viewers. I think the fact that we've been waiting since December for this to happen indicates the level and the depth of horse trading that's been happening behind the scenes as the president was firstly trying to deal with the fact that there were some exits that happened from his cabinet, Minister Mbalula in particular, and Minister Ayanda, whom he needed to replace. And then also the question of, well, if you're going to convince South Africans that you're doing things differently, what should they look like? What should the new structure look like in order for people to feel that something is being done? The biggest headache relating to the energy crisis is obviously the lack of consensus between the president himself, Minister Mantashe, and Minister Gordon about how the country's energy security issues needed to be addressed. And of course, we know that at the ANC conference, the view of the delegates was that the ESCOM in particular needed to be moved from the control of Minister Gordon. Rather than follow that ruling, the president has then decided to bring it in-house by creating a new structure, which is a Minister of Electricity in the presidency. So the sum of all of those particular activities indicates a rather delicate tightrope that he's been trying to walk over the past couple of months. And then obviously yesterday he gave us what he believes is the best outcome from the negotiations and the conversations that he's had since then.
Yeah. So some of your commentary around this process has included words like a world of ever declining standards and low expectations. What should South Africans be demanding of government?
I think historically, President Ramaphosa was on the right track in that he said he was going to put together some key performance indicators for his particular ministers. And the reason that mattered is that up until now, it really was a very fluid social compact that we had. Our ministers, a person will be allocated to one portfolio during this administration. In the middle of that, they'd be changed to a completely different portfolio without us ever understanding what exactly are the unique skills or the unique insights that they bring to those portfolios that then allows them to objectively assess them against that particular performance. So when these KPIs came in, it made it a bit easier for you and I to be able to go and see that when it comes to the Minister of Labour and Employment, these are the jobs that he's expected to create in the medium term. These are the jobs that he's supposed to create in a 5-year term. That then makes it very easy for us to be able to go and say, well, actually, this person has not achieved. So the reason that all matters is that you must remember that these KPIs were an agreement between the president himself and his ministers. He's had them for the better part of 5 years, and people haven't met their KPIs, and yet he does nothing to move them around or does nothing to support them better in order to deliver on those KPIs. So that's why we sort of didn't have to talk about the very low expectations, because it now feels like even the KPI process was an exercise in optics rather than it forming the basis of the engagement between the president and his ministers and between the ministers and society.
So you speak about KPIs. Paul Mashatile is the new deputy president. Some analysis saying he will not settle for scraps thrown from the master's table and will want a real job. What will characterize Paul Mashatile's or the second in charge's time in Parliament, in government?
Well, luckily for him, he is starting off on a zero base because the previous incumbent of that job spent 5 years showing us how you can disappear from view and people just do not know what you're doing. So because the job has become so invisible under David Mabuza, Paul Mashatile has got a blank slate to then craft whatever agenda he feels is necessary for him to feel that he's adding value to the state. And the concept of adding value is a remarkably important one because obviously this is a very well high-paying job. It's a politically important job. You are essentially one heartbeat away from running the country. So you need to be able to sort of add some substance to what the job is about. We do know that he will become the leader of government business, but even then, Mr. Mabuza only showed up in parliament if the law compelled him to do so. So that lack of energy and that lack of enterprise that we saw in Mr. Mabuza's time is something that we hope does not get replicated under this particular administration, particularly also, of course, because the ANC is going into a very difficult general election period where they are at risk of losing their majority. So you want all hands on deck, and you cannot afford to be carrying dead weight of someone who's got political seniority but just doesn't seem to be doing anything.
Now, a piece in the Sunday paper said Eskom doesn't need an engineer at this time, but somebody with business savvy. I know Dr. Cyril Ramaphosa is not going to Eskom, but will his engineering background change the electricity woes of the country?
So the problem with Eskom is that it's a combination of the technical issues, the financial issues, and the strategy/policy issues. So of course, we are not going to get the perfect human being who has mastered all of that craft in one way or another. What we are hoping to get by the time they look for a CEO is someone who's able to say, these are the skills that I have, this is the support that I need in order to execute on the overall mandate of Eskom. So that's really what we're looking for. We're not going to find some heaven-sent angel who has mastered all of those skills, especially at the type of level and the depth that is required for an entity like Eskom. The presence of Mr. Ramaphosa, obviously within the conversation or within the room when deliberations about Eskom are happening, is probably a good move politically, in that you obviously have someone who at least has an intimate understanding of the basics of engineering, even if it's not primarily electrical engineering. That type of conversation then enables people within the room to be able to tap into him and ask, well, from your understanding of how engineering big projects work in particular, what needs to be done? So I think politically it does add, even though traditional engineers within Eskom may feel that, well, actually they are primarily more engaged or more intimately engaged with the Eskom issues than anyone who's been in political office rather than practicing that craft.
And Pakstau coming in as a deputy minister, what are your thoughts on his particular placement? Conversation going into this process was that he was going to get the ministerial post.
I think that is probably the great disappointment, or at least the great surprise, rather, that we saw yesterday, because you'd have imagined that given his background in frontline politics, particularly in the city and Gauteng at large, you'd have thought that he would have been in prime position to be allocated a more senior position that then sort of takes into account the skills that he has. And I think also, obviously, if you then look at what the configuration of cabinet is about, we always knew that there's always going to be particular trade-offs that don't get explained to us. The question of how do you get the representation of particular alliance partners, how do you get the gender parity dimension? So it may be a case of, well, actually at the point in time when I had to look at the final picture, I had far too many men, for example, in frontline positions. So therefore, I needed to balance the scale. We'll never know that, but I do think that perhaps he will be underutilized in a portfolio where he's a deputy minister rather than someone who can cultivate his rather energetic skills to actually lead a ministry.
Just overall for you, what were the hits and the misses?
I think obviously the most surprising thing is the fact that in spite of the president's commitment to austerity, in spite of his own commitment to rationalizing his own executive, he has actually gone in the opposite direction. Now, of course, he's going to try and sell it in many ways and say that it's a temporary measure, but let's face it, he's been in office since Valentine's Day 2018. So it's no longer a matter of doing interim measures. We now need to be asking what exactly is he doing substantively to cement his legacy as the president of the country. That for me was the surprising aspect of it. And then there's also what is becoming quite clearly a centralization of power, or at least a creation of a much greater sense of proximity with the things that the president treasures the most. So if you look at the number of ministers now that are based in the presidency that report directly to him, that seems to be an indication that perhaps the distance that currently exists between the presidency and the different ministries or scattered all around the capital city hasn't delivered the outcomes that the president wants. So whether now this internal cabinet, as you may call it, that seems to be based at the West Wing, will be able to ensure that the president's program of action is executed a bit better going forward is something we have to wait and see. But I think historically it's been sometimes very difficult to figure out what exactly is the definition of the role of the minister in the presidency, particularly when there's other ministers in the presidency whose job profiles seem to be a bit more clearer to understand.
Khaya, thank you so much for your time this morning.